5 seconds of silence. Welcome. Today, we're going to conduct a rigorous examination of a methodology known as activity-based costing, or ABC. Now, this isn't just another term from a managerial accounting textbook. It's a profoundly important strategic tool. We're going to go beyond the basic definitions to really understand how it works, why it's so critical, and frankly, where it has its limitations. So here's our agenda. We'll begin with the foundational problem itself, overhead costs. From there, we'll look at why the older traditional systems are often inadequate. Then, of course, we'll introduce activity-based costing, walk through the 4 steps for implementing it, evaluate when it makes strategic sense, and finally, look at its implications beyond the world of manufacturing. All right, let's delineate the central challenge. To determine if a product is truly profitable, you absolutely must know its true cost. Now, some parts of that cost are easy to trace. Direct materials, direct labor, no problem. But the difficult part, the real puzzle, is allocating all of those indirect overhead costs. Think factory rent, machine maintenance, supervision, to each individual product. This allocation problem is truly the crux of management accounting.
Historically, organizations have relied on what we call traditional costing systems to solve this puzzle. But, as we are about to see, these systems are predicated on a paradigm that is becoming less and less relevant in our complex modern economy.
The core idea here is, well, simple. The traditional system allocates all plant-wide overhead using a single rate, and that rate is tied directly to production volume. It assumes that if you run the machines for twice as long, you'll consume twice the overhead. It posits a direct, almost perfect relationship between production volume and the consumption of overhead resources. Now, let's be clear. This system isn't inherently flawed. It was simply designed for a different era of manufacturing. It maintains its validity perfectly well under 2 specific conditions. 1, direct labor has to be a significant portion of the total product cost. And 2, there needs to be a very high correlation between those labor hours and the overhead costs being incurred. Think of a labor-intensive assembly line from 50 years ago. In that context, this approach works just fine. But that's precisely the issue. The assumptions underlying this traditional approach have broken down. Modern manufacturing is defined by automation, by complexity, by high product diversity. And because of this, that tight correlation between volume and overhead has been severed. When that link weakens, the accuracy of your product costing is fundamentally compromised. And this, of course, can lead to some disastrously poor strategic decisions. And this brings us to activity-based costing. I want to be very clear. ABC is not just some minor tweak or incremental improvement. It represents a genuine paradigm shift in the philosophy of cost accounting. It fundamentally rethinks the relationship between the resources a company uses and the products it sells. The foundational premise of ABC is this: activities are what consume resources, and products in turn consume activities. You see the shift? The focus moves away from the final product and onto the discrete activities required to create it. And an activity can be almost anything. Setting up a machine for a new batch, designing a new component, processing a sales order, you name it. So how do we link the cost of those activities to the products? Well, for that, we have to identify what are called cost drivers. A cost driver is the specific factor that has a direct cause and effect relationship with the resources an activity consumes. This is the linchpin. It's the measurable link in the chain that ABC is designed to reveal. This table here offers some excellent, concrete examples of this principle in action. Look at machine setups. The cost isn't really driven by how many units you make after the setup is done. It's driven by the number of setups you have to perform. Or think about product design. The cost of that activity is much more closely related to the number of individual parts in the product than it is to the final production volume. This is the kind of nuance that ABC brings to the table. And this graphic illustrates the fundamental structural difference beautifully. Traditional costing, you see, is a one-stage process. You take all the overhead costs and dump them directly onto the products. ABC, on the other hand, is a 2-stage process. It introduces a critical intermediate step. You first allocate overhead costs to specific activity cost pools, and then you allocate the costs from those pools to the products based on how much each product actually used that activity. All right, this all sounds quite sophisticated in theory, but how does an organization actually implement such a system? Well, let's delineate the implementation framework into 4 clear, logical steps. So here's the process. First, you have to identify all the significant activities and allocate your overhead costs to them, creating what we call cost pools. Make no mistake, this is a major undertaking. Second, for each of those cost pools, you must identify the appropriate cost driver. Third comes the calculation. You compute the activity-based overhead rate for each driver. And finally, in the fourth step, you use those rates to assign the overhead costs to your products. Now, that calculation in step 3 is absolutely crucial. This formula is how you establish a precise, granular rate for how much overhead is consumed per unit of a cost driver. So, for the first time, you can answer questions like, what is the exact cost of performing one quality inspection? Or how much does a single machine setup actually cost us? It provides a level of detail that was simply impossible before. And here is the payoff for all of this detailed work. When you apply these more accurate rates, you almost invariably see a significant shift in your reported product costs. Your simple, high-volume products, well, they suddenly look much more profitable because they were being over-allocated overhead they never actually used. Meanwhile, your low-volume, complex, specialty products are correctly identified as being far more costly because they're the ones consuming a disproportionate amount of those special handling activities like setups and inspections. You finally get a true cost profile for every product. Now, achieving this enhanced accuracy isn't just an academic exercise for the accounting department. This data feeds directly into a strategic decision-making framework for senior management, but adopting it requires careful thought. So, any organization considering a move to ABC must perform a very careful cost-benefit analysis. You have to weigh the undeniable advantages of having more accurate cost data against the very real complexities and limitations that come with the methodology. The primary benefits really fall into 3 categories. First, by its very nature, using multiple targeted cost pools instead of one big one leads to more accurate costing. That's a given. Second, it gives managers much greater control over overhead costs because they can finally see which activities are driving those costs. And third, and arguably most important, this better information facilitates much better strategic decisions on pricing, on which products to promote, and where to focus process improvements. However, we must also acknowledge its limitations. ABC is not a silver bullet. The most significant drawback is practical. These systems are complex, and therefore they can be quite expensive to design, implement, and maintain. Furthermore, some facility-level costs, things like the factory manager's salary or property taxes, are still very difficult to trace to a specific activity, so some degree of arbitrary allocation often remains. So, how do you know if it's right for you? Well, there are several key indicators that suggest a switch to ABC is warranted. If your product lines are numerous and diverse, differing greatly in volume and complexity, that's a big one. Another is if overhead costs are a significant chunk of your total costs. But one of the most telling signs is when you discover that your managers are creating their own bootleg costing systems on spreadsheets because they no longer trust the official numbers. That's a huge red flag that your system has lost its credibility. Finally, it is imperative to recognize that the principles of activity-based costing are not confined to the manufacturing sector. They have broad applications in service industries as well. Now, while the principles translate directly, the implementation in a service industry can present unique challenges. The primary issue is that service organizations often have a much larger proportion of these general, facility-level overhead costs that are very difficult to trace directly to specific service activities. Think about a law firm or a hospital. A lot of the overhead is very general, which can complicate the process. This leaves us with a final, critical consideration. Activity-based costing is fundamentally a strategic instrument. And in our modern era of intense global competition, where margins are everything, the question is not simply whether a business can afford to implement a more accurate costing system. The real question is, can it afford not to? In short, can any modern enterprise truly optimize its strategy if it doesn't really know its true costs?